So we've looked at this part of our public health policy in terms of vaccines and safety. Well, let's move on to the second portion, which is vaccines are effective and the effects are long-lasting. What's the meaning of efficacy? That's kind of a big doctor kind of word, and we throw that word around a lot. So what does that really mean? Well, again, it's not exactly what you think. The Webster's definition of efficacy is the power to produce intended results. So we want to do something, and if we get that result, then we consider whatever we did to be effective. Well, when I started going through and reading all these vaccine studies, and I've read hundreds, I guess, over the course of the last couple of years, I came to the conclusion that this definition of efficacy is kind of slippery business, because it's kind of like vaccination and immunization. There's two separate definitions of efficacy. There's research efficacy, which means I give you a shot and you developed an antibody, but then there's clinical efficacy, which means the ability to prevent infection. And I truly believe that most physicians, when they read vaccine studies or when they use the word efficacy, when they say that vaccines are safe and effective, what they're thinking in their mind is that means that when you get a vaccine, it will effectively protect you from the infection. So they're thinking about the clinical efficacy, not the fact that what the science is really looking at, what these studies are really looking at, is whether or not you've developed an antibody response. So the science is based on research efficacy, not clinical efficacy. Well, is that just my thinking? Did I just make that up? Well, I think not, because when you go through and read some of the things about the individual vaccines, I think you'll be surprised. What it says about the chickenpox vaccine, that no data exists regarding post-exposure efficacy of the varicella vaccine, which means if you get the vaccine after you've been exposed, we don't know if it's going to help you or not, because if you're exposed, you already have an antibody. And the relative contribution of immune response to protection from the chickenpox vaccine is unknown. And there is insufficient data to assess the rate of protection against the complication of chickenpox, encephalitis, hepatitis, and pneumonia in children. So what is the main reason why they tell you you need to get the chickenpox vaccine is so that you don't end up with these terrible complications. But the Merck, who makes the stuff, says, well, we don't really know whether or not the chickenpox vaccine protects you from those serious complications. All we do know is that if you get a shot, you get an antibody. That part we know. Well, what about pertussis? The findings of efficacy studies have not demonstrated a direct correlation between antibody response and the protection against pertussis disease. So you get an antibody. What does it mean? Well, it's effective. We gave you a vaccine and it's research effective. You got the antibody, but it's not necessarily clinically effective. What about the Hib, or the H flu, which is a bacteria that can cause ear infections, pneumonia, or meningitis? The antibody contribution to clinical protection is unknown. We don't know if you get that antibody if it's going to clinically protect you or not. And the precise level of antibody required for protecting against invasive disease, we don't know that one either. So we know that when we give you a shot, you develop an antibody, but we really don't know whether you get that antibody if it's going to do anything for you or not. And what about smallpox? And this came from a JAMA article back in 1999. And it said that neutralizing antibodies are reported to reflect levels of protection, although this has not been validated in the field. So you can get antibodies, but we really don't know if this is going to protect you or not. And this came from a research interview from Dr. John March from the Morden Research Institute in Scotland, where they do a lot of investigation in animal studies, primarily with vaccines in animals. And what he said in that interview was, particularly for viral diseases, the cellular immune response is most important, and antibody levels and protection are totally unconnected. So this is something that we kind of know, but it's not anything that we put into practice. We really do believe that effective means clinical protection, and those two things, just like vaccination and immunization aren't synonyms, neither are vaccination and antibody production synonymous with protection. So conclusions regarding efficacy is that vaccines effectively induce the production of antibodies. That we do know, and that's what they're actually looking for when they're doing the research studies. And if this is the intended results, then it is correct for the CDC to declare that vaccines are effective. We do get an antibody. Vaccines have not really been proven to be clinically effective. And if protection from disease is the intended result, then the CDC's message is at best incorrect and at worst deceptive.